morning smelled of metal polish and damp wool, and something else underneath both of those things. Something that had no name yet, but that every person standing in that line would be able to identify for the rest of their lives. The smell of not knowing if you were good enough. The smell of waiting to find out. Wellington Barracks on a grey Tuesday in October sat behind its iron railings the way it always had, solid, indifferent, older than anything the recruits standing inside it had ever touched. The parade ground was damp. The sky above it was the particular shade of London white that wasn't quite cloud and wasn't quite nothing. 41 recruits stood in 2 rows, chests out, chins up, arms locked at their sides, eyes forward on a point in the middle distance that didn't exist. Danny Okafor was in the 2nd row, 4th from the left. He was 19 years old, 5'11", with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's habit of going very still when he was nervous. He had been very still since 5:30 that morning. He had been awake since 3. The boots had taken him until midnight to finish. He had started them after dinner. Kit laid out on the narrow bed the way they'd been shown, tin of kiwi black open on the folded towel, the small cloth wrapped twice around 2 fingers the way the corporal had demonstrated exactly once and not again. He had worked for 6 hours. He had buffed and breathed and buffed again, building the shine in slow circles the way you were supposed to, layer after layer, each one thinner than the last. By 11, he could see his reflection in the toe cap. By midnight, the reflection was clear enough that he could make out the expression on his own face. He had looked at that face for a long moment. Then he had wrapped the boots carefully in the cloth, placed them beside the bed, and told himself they were ready. He had not slept well. The dreams, when they came, were not dramatic. He did not dream of failing or falling or being sent home. He dreamed of the boots sitting on the floor and a feeling that something was not right about them that he could not identify no matter how close he looked. He woke at 3 with his heart going too fast and lay in the dark barracks listening to the breathing of 11 other recruits until the 5:15 alarm made the decision for him. Now he stood in the inspection line and did not look at his boots and tried to believe that 6 hours of work was enough. Colour Sergeant Harwick came around the corner of the building at precisely 7:15. There was a way some people moved through a space that made the space smaller. Not through size. Harwick was not a large man. Medium height, trim, somewhere in his mid-40s with grey at his temples and a face that weather and years of cold mornings had pressed into something close to permanent neutral. But he moved through the parade ground the way a low-pressure system moved through a forecast. Everything in his path adjusted without being told. He started at the far end of the 1st row. Danny watched him from the corner of his eye, the way you watch something you're pretending not to watch. Harwick moved methodically. He did not hurry. He stopped at each recruit for between 4 and 12 seconds. Danny counted, he couldn't help it, and said something quiet that the wind took before it reached the 2nd row. Some recruits gave a small nod. One adjusted his cap. One went slightly paler. He reached the end of the 1st row and turned the 2nd row. Danny fixed his eyes on the middle distance and breathed through his nose and thought about nothing in particular, and thought about his boots and thought about nothing in particular. Harwick reached him. He stopped. He looked down. The pause was not dramatic. It was 4 seconds, maybe 5. But it had a quality to it that was different from the pauses before. It was not the pause of a man finding something acceptable. It was the pause of a man being careful about what he said next. He looked up. His expression had not changed. These will not do. That was all. 4 words, no elaboration, no instruction. No indication of what specifically would not do, or what doing would look like, or how far from doing the boots currently were. He had already moved on to the next recruit before the words had fully arrived. Danny stared at the middle distance. The sky above the parade ground was still the same shade of London white. The damp was still in the air. 40 other recruits were still standing in their rows. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 4 seconds ago. The boots had not changed. Danny had not changed. Something had, though. He couldn't have said what. The morning's training moved on the way mornings did, drills and commands, and the particular physical language of people learning to move as a unit rather than as individuals. Danny moved through it. He was present. His body did what it was told. But somewhere underneath the drills, a quieter process was running, patient and persistent, turning the 4 words over like a stone in a tumbler. These will not do. He had worked for 6 hours. He had done everything he knew how to do. He had produced, by any measure he could apply, the best result he was capable of. And it had not been enough, and he didn't know why. And no one was going to tell him. At lunch, Priya Mehta sat across from him with her tray and her characteristic expression of someone conserving energy for things that deserved it. Priya was from Leicester, 20 years old, with sharp dark eyes and the kind of dry economy of speech that made every sentence she said feel like it had been edited twice before delivery. She had passed the morning inspection. Her boots, Danny had seen, held a shine so deep and consistent, it looked less like polish and more like the leather had been replaced with something else entirely. He looked at her across the table. "How?" he said. Priya picked up her fork. "How what? Your boots," she chewed. Considered. "How long did you work on yours?" 6 hours. She looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite its absence. "That's the problem probably." Danny waited. "Nobody tells you," she said. "That's the point. You're supposed to figure it out. The method, the time. What works on this boot versus that boot? They show you once, and then you either work it out or you don't. And the ones who work it out are the ones who were going to anyway. That's not helpful." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She ate. "But it's true." Danny looked at his food. "What did you do differently?" he asked. Priya was quiet for a moment, and he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "I didn't try to get it right. I tried to understand what right looked like. Different thing." She didn't explain further. Danny got the impression, not for the first time, that Priya considered over-explaining a form of disrespect. He thought about what she'd said for the rest of the afternoon. His father had driven him to the train station on the morning he left Peckham. A Saturday in September. Early, the streets still quiet, the lights still low and amber through the terraced houses. His father, Emmanuel Okafor, drove the way he did everything without excess. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or advice. He drove, and Danny sat, and the city moved past the windows in its grey and gold morning colors. At the station, his father had taken a tin from his jacket pocket and held it out. Kiwi black. The tin was old, slightly dented at one edge, the kind of thing that had been in a drawer for years. "For your boots," his father said. Danny had taken it. He didn't know then that his father had bought it new the week before and left it on the shelf in the garage for 3 days before deciding to make it look old, to make it look like something passed down. He found that out later from his mother, who told it as a small, funny story. But by then, he understood it wasn't funny. It was just the way his father loved things, quietly, without announcement, with a level of care that he hoped you wouldn't notice, because noticing it would make it smaller somehow. Emmanuel Okafor had been a postman for 22 years. He left the house at 5:40 every morning. He came home at 2. He ironed his uniform shirt every single morning before he left, standing at the board in the kitchen with the radio on low, pressing the sleeves flat with a care that the job never required and that he never explained. Danny had asked him about it once when he was about 12. "Why do you iron it every day? Nobody sees it under the jacket." His father had looked at the shirt on the board and then at Danny. "I see it," he said. Danny had nodded as if he understood and gone back to his cereal. He had not understood. Not then. He was 12. Now he was 19 and standing in a barracks with a failed inspection and 6 hours of work behind him and the tin of kiwi black on the shelf above his bed. And he was beginning to... The barracks went quiet by 10:30. Lights out was 11. But most of the recruits were horizontal well before that. The training days compressed a full week of ordinary tiredness into 8 hours. And the body learned fast to take sleep when sleep was available. Danny lay on his bunk and looked at the ceiling. The boots were on the floor beside the bed. He had cleaned them again before dinner, trying to correct whatever Harwick had seen without knowing what Harwick had seen. He had used the same method, the same cloth, the same thin layers. The result looked, to him, identical to the result of the night before. That was the problem. He couldn't see the difference, and if he couldn't see the difference, he couldn't fix it. He listened to the breathing of the room settle into the particular rhythm of people asleep. Priya's bunk was across the narrow aisle. He could hear her breathing slow, and even out before 11. At 11:15, Danny sat up. He reached down and picked up the boots. He carried them to the ablutions, the long tiled room with the strip lighting and the sinks that ran too hot or too cold and never in between. He set them on the edge of a sink and looked at them under the fluorescent light, which was different from any light he had worked under before, and which showed things that softer light concealed. He could see it now, not one thing, several. The shine was present, but uneven brighter in the areas where he had concentrated his effort. Duller in the transitions between those areas, a landscape of almost good that from a foot away looked passable, and from 6 inches looked like exactly what it was. Work done by someone who understood the destination, but not the road. There were micro scratches in the toe cap that the polish had filled but not erased. There was a slight cloudiness at the heel that he had mistaken in the warmer light of the barracks for depth. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he went back to his bunk, got the tin of kiwi, the cloth, the bone-handled spoon he'd been told he'd need and hadn't understood why until now, and came back to the sink. He ran the tap until the water was neither too hot nor too cold. He wrapped the cloth around 2 fingers. He opened the tin. He started again from 0. The thing about starting from 0 at 11:30 at night, when you have been awake since 5:15 in the morning, is that the body lodges a formal complaint, and then, when ignored, goes quiet. There is a level of tiredness past which tiredness stops announcing itself and becomes instead a kind of flatness, everything slightly further away, slightly slower, the edges of things less defined. Danny moved through that flatness and kept working. He was not thinking about the inspection. He was not thinking about Harwick. He had stopped, somewhere around midnight, thinking about results at all. What he was doing had narrowed down to what was directly in front of him. This section of leather, this pass of the cloth, this small inadequacy being addressed, and the next one being found. It was not pleasant, exactly, but it was clear. In a day full of things he didn't fully understand and a future full of things he couldn't predict, the boot in his hands had the great virtue of being a problem he could actually see. Priya appeared in the doorway at 12:40. She was in her off-duty clothes, carrying her own boots, with the expression of someone who had made a decision they weren't going to explain. She set herself up 2 sinks down without a word. Danny looked at her. "Couldn't sleep," she said, not looking up. "Your boots passed," Danny said. "I know," she opened her tin, "but they could be better." They worked in silence after that. The strip light hummed its single flat note. Water ran occasionally. The smell of polish built in the tiled space, sharp and waxy and oddly comforting, the way particular smells become attached to particular kinds of effort. Around 1:30, Priya said without looking up, "Why did you want to do this?" Danny kept working. The guards, yay, he thought about it. The honest answer had several layers, and he wasn't sure which one to give. "My granddad has a photo," he said eventually. "From the 60s, he was visiting from Lagos, first time in London. He's standing outside Buckingham Palace, and there's a guardsman behind him, and my granddad is grinning like, like it's the best day. And the guardsman is just standing there, completely still, this straight line in the background." He turned the boot slightly under the light. "I grew up looking at that photo. I just always wanted to be the straight line." Priya was quiet. "That's a good reason," she said. At 2:15, she held up her boot, examined it, made a sound of mild dissatisfaction, and kept going. At 3 o'clock, Danny hit a wall. Not a metaphorical wall. A specific physical total absence of forward momentum. He was sitting on the edge of a sink with the boot in his lap and his hands had stopped moving, and he was aware, in a very clear and unhelpful way, that the boot looked worse than it had at 11:30. He had worked for 3.5 hours and produced a result that was objectively inferior to his starting point. He set the boot down on the cold tile floor. He looked at it. The fluorescent light hummed. This was the moment. If the story were a film, this would be the moment for the swelling music or the speech, the internal monologue where the protagonist finds their resolve and delivers it in neat, speakable sentences. But Danny Okafor was 19 years old and exhausted and sitting on a cold floor in a barracks bathroom at 3 in the morning, and what he felt was not cinematic. It was smaller than that. It was a quiet question that had no particular drama to it. What are you going to do? Not the army, not his father, not Harwick, him. What was he going to do right now with this boot and this cloth and this cold floor? He picked up the boot. He looked at it for a long time under the light, really looked the way Priya had said, not to get it right, but to understand what right looked like. And this time, tired enough that his usual habits of thought had gone quiet, he saw something he hadn't seen before. The problem wasn't the polish, the problem was the leather underneath the polish. He had been putting layer on layer without ever truly preparing what was underneath. The foundation was soft in places, rough in others, and no amount of polish would make an uneven foundation into a mirror. He needed to go further back than he'd ever gone. He worked differently after that. Slower, more deliberate. Less focused on the shine he was building and more focused on the surface he was building it on. It was not faster, it was not easier, but it had the quality of actually addressing the thing that needed addressing, which is different from working hard at the thing adjacent to it. Priya left at 4:15. She held her boots up once, looked at them, nodded once. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the look of someone who had gotten as far as the current night would take them. "Get some sleep," she said. "Hour," Danny said. She looked at him. "Don't break them trying to make them perfect." She left. Danny kept going until 5. At 5 o'clock, he held the left boot under the fluorescent light and turned it slowly. It was not the boot he had imagined producing when he started, it was something else. The shine had a depth to it that his midnight work had not achieved. Not a surface gloss, but something that seemed to come from inside the leather itself. A darkness within the shine that made the light look like it was being gathered, rather than reflected. The toe cap held his face back at him with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. The heel was consistent. The transitions he had failed the night before were present, and even he set it down, picked up the right, same thing. He was aware that he might be too tired to evaluate them accurately. That what he was seeing as good might simply be what 3.5 hours of uncorrected effort produced when your standards for comparison had been dissolved by exhaustion. He held this possibility carefully, looked at the boots, and decided that this was not that. These were different. He didn't know how to say what was different about them in language that would have meant anything to him 24 hours ago. The boots he had produced the first night were the result of effort applied to a goal. These were the result of effort applied to understanding. The outcome looked similar to someone walking past, to someone stopped in front of them. Looking closely, it was not. He went back to the barracks. He placed the boots beside the bed. He lay down. He was asleep in under 3 minutes, which was itself a kind of verdict. The alarm at 5:15 had the quality of an insult. Danny dressed in the dark, the way the body dresses when the mind has not fully returned to duty correctly, in order, by memory. He laced the boots without looking at them. He picked up his cap. He went to the parade ground. Priya was already in her row. She glanced at his boots once as he took his position. Her face did not change in any dramatic way, but she looked for a moment longer than she had the morning before. Danny stood in the line and breathed. The sky was doing something different from yesterday. There was light in it, early, thin, the particular quality of October light that arrives like an apology and still manages to be beautiful. The parade ground had dried overnight. The iron railings of Wellington Barracks caught the first of it and held a thin cold shine along their upper edges. Color Sergeant Harwick came around the corner at 7:15. Same time, same pace, same quality of movement that compressed the space around him. He started at the far end of the first row and the second row waited. Danny fixed his eyes on the middle distance. He thought about the photograph on his father's shelf, his grandfather in Lagos visiting clothes, grinning, and behind him the straight line of the guardsman. Perfectly still, part of the background and somehow the whole point of the image. He thought about his father at the ironing board. At 5:30 in the morning, with the radio on low, pressing the sleeves of a shirt that nobody would see. He thought about the cold floor and the fluorescent light and the decision that hadn't felt like a decision because there hadn't really been an alternative. Harwick reached the second row. He moved along it. 4 seconds, 7:5. He reached Danny. He stopped. He looked down. The pause this time was different from the pause of the day before in a way that Danny could feel more than measure. It had a different quality. The pause of yesterday had been the pause of a man recording a deficit. This pause was something else. It was the pause of a man looking at something with attention. Real attention, the kind that isn't performed. It lasted longer. 8 seconds. 10. Harwick looked up. He said nothing. He moved on to the next recruit, that was all. No pass, no comment, no acknowledgement in words. Just the absence of the 4 words that had landed like a verdict the morning before. Just the silence where those words had been and the moving on. Danny breathed. It was not a triumph, not in the way the word usually meant. No announcement, no crowd, nothing to point at. It was smaller than that. It was the space where a specific failure used to be, now empty, now simply gone. It was 4 words that didn't come. It was a man looking at his work with real attention and deciding it had earned the next moment. It was enough. It was completely enough. In the evening, after drills and dinner and the slow unwinding of a day that had started before the light, Danny sat on his bunk and took out his phone. He called his father. Emmanuel Okafor picked up on the 3rd ring, the way he always did. Danny. Not a question, not a greeting, exactly. Just the name spoken in the tone of a man, for whom the fact of his son calling was sufficient information and sufficient occasion. Dad? A pause. His father's version of "How are you?" "I'm all right," Danny said. "I wanted to ask you something." "Okay." Danny looked at the boots on the floor beside the bed. In the warm light of the barracks, they looked different from how they had looked under the fluorescent strip. Quieter, somehow, more certain. "Your shirt," Danny said. "The uniform, you iron it every morning. You have done since before I was born." "Yes," his father said. "Is it about the shirt?" A long pause. The particular quality of his father's pauses, not the absence of thought, but thought being given its proper time. "No," Emmanuel said. "It's never been about the shirt." Danny waited. "In the morning," his father said, "before the day has told you what it's going to be, when it's still just you, in the kitchen, with your hands doing a thing carefully, that's when you decide what kind of person you are that day. The shirt is just where I put that decision." A pause. "Does that make sense?" Danny looked at the boots. "Yeah," he said. "It does." He heard his father's small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. The sound of a man who has been waiting a long time for a question and is glad it finally came. "Good," Emmanuel said. "Get some sleep." They said goodbye in the way their family said goodbye, briefly without ceremony, with an entire conversation folded into the moment of hanging up. Danny set the phone down. He reached up to the shelf and picked up the tin of Kiwi Black. Slightly dented at one edge, older looking than it was, he turned it over in his hands once, the way you turn over something you suddenly understand the weight of, and set it back on the shelf. He lay back on the bunk. The barracks was doing its evening thing. Voices, footsteps, the distant clatter of the ablutions, the building settling into the noise of people who were tired and fed and still here, still present, not yet broken. Priya's voice came from across the aisle. "How were they?" Danny looked at the ceiling. He didn't say anything. Danny said a pause. "Yeah," Priya said. "That's what passing sounds like. There are things you can be taught and things you cannot be taught, and the distance between them is not always obvious from the outside. You can be shown a method. You can be given the equipment. You can be put in a room with 40 other people who are all trying to learn the same thing at the same time. None of that is the thing itself. The thing itself is what happens at 3 in the morning on a cold tile floor when nobody is watching and the work has gotten worse instead of better, and the morning is still 2 hours away. The thing itself is the decision that doesn't feel like a decision because there is genuinely no alternative. Not because someone told you there wasn't, but because you looked at the alternatives and found that they were not actually available to you. Not because of the army or the sergeant or the inspection, because of who you are, because of what you cannot make yourself do. Danny Okafor was not the best recruit in his intake. He was not the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally suited to the 1,000 physical and psychological demands that the next months would make of him. There would be days when he would struggle with things that others handled easily. There would be assessments he would have to sit twice. Drills he would have to repeat, moments when the gap between where he was and where he needed to be would feel less like a gap and more like a landscape. But there would not be another night like that one. Not because the nights would get easier. Because something had been established in him on that cold floor at 3 in the morning that did not need to be established again. A kind of floor beneath the floor, the knowledge held not in the mind, but somewhere lower and more reliable. That when he arrived at the place where work got worse before it got better, he would keep working, not bravely, not dramatically, just keep working. The way his father pressed a shirt, the way his grandfather stood in the background of a photograph quietly, without performance, as if this was simply what a person did. Colour Sergeant Harwick would retire 7 years later. At his leaving dinner, asked if he remembered any particular recruits from his time at Wellington, he mentioned 3 names. Danny Okafor was one of them. He did not explain why. He was not asked to. The photograph of Danny's grandfather still sits on a shelf in his parents' house in Peckham. His grandfather grinning in his Lagos clothes outside Buckingham Palace. And behind him, perfectly still, part of the background and entirely the point, the straight line of the guardsman. Danny has seen it 10,000 times. He has never been tired of it. And somewhere in the barracks on a shelf, slightly dented at one edge, older looking than it is, a tin of Kiwi Black sits with the quiet patience of something that has already done its most important work and is content to wait for the next time it is needed, which will be tomorrow morning, 5:15, without fail.